Our discussion will center on the largest and most diverse group in the plant kingdom, the angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that produce flowers and bear their seeds in fruits. By the end of the video, you can identify the parts and function of a flower, explain the life cycle of angiosperms, and list various methods of pollination. Many flowering plant species, including many of the crops we raise for food, depend on animals for pollination. Bees, for instance, are proficient pollinators. Unfortunately, bee populations worldwide are plummeting. Some possible culprits include the use of insecticides and bacterial diseases. The falling bee populations will soon lead to declining crops and the extinctions of many native plant species. So what can ordinary people do to help? Some strategies include avoiding the use of pesticides, planting clusters of diverse native plants in yards, and providing the nesting habitat for bees and surrounding agricultural fields with native grasses, herbs, and trees. As we will see in this video, pollination is a critical link in the life cycle of the flowering plant. So, insects see the world very differently from how humans see it. Bees don't see the same flower color that we do. Even though humans can see more colors, bees have a much broader range of color vision. Their ability to see ultraviolet light gives them an advantage when seeking nectar. To visualize, a special type of photography gives us a hint at how wonderful flowers looks like to a bee or other insects. So as mentioned, pollination plays a major role in the sexual reproduction of plants. Pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male part to the female part of the flower. Pollination can occur by wind, water, or animals. Abiotic pollination uses non-living methods such as wind and water to move pollen from one flower to another. Among abiotically pollinated species, 98% rely on wind and only 2% on water. Since their reproductive success does not depend on attracting pollinators, there has been no selective pressure favoring colorful or scented flowers. Biotic pollination, on the other hand, relies on living pollinators to move the pollen from one flower to another. Apart from bees, it also includes birds, bats, butterflies, and moths. Some species of plants have an exclusive relationship to a specific type of pollinator. For example, some species have fused flower petals that form long tube-like structures bearing nectary stuck deep inside. Only a pollinator with a proboscis as long as this tube is permitted for pollination to occur. As a result, this allowed for evolution to take place. When two interacting species cause for each other to adapt and later on evolve, we call this as coevolution. To better understand how angiosperms sexually reproduce, let us first identify its parts and the functions that they serve. Flowers are typically composed of 4 types of floral organs. These are the carpels, the stamens, petals, and sepals. So an open flower has a whorl of petals, whose color accounts for the attractiveness of many flowers. The size, shape, and color of petals are attractive to specific pollinators as well. The sepals are the most leaf-like of all the flower parts. They are usually green, but some resemble petals. Sepals protect the bud as the flower develops. Stamens are the male portion of the flower. Each stamen has 2 parts: the anther, a sac-like container, and a filament, which is a slender stalk. At the very center of the flower is the carpel. It is a vase-like structure that represents the female portion of the flower. A carpel usually has 4 parts: the stigma, that is an enlarged sticky knob, the style, which is a slender stalk, and the ovary, which is an enlarged base that encloses one or more ovules. Now let us further see the structure of the male and the female portion of the flower. So stamen is the male reproductive organ of a flower, and it is specialized for reproduction. It consists of a stalk called the filament and a terminal structure called the anther. Within the anther are chambers called pollen sacs that produce pollen grains. Each of these pollen grains now contains the male sex cells or the sperm cells. Carpel is the female reproductive organ of a flower. A flower may consist of one or more carpels, and the base of each carpel is called an ovary, and it encloses one or more egg-bearing ovules. The upper part of each carpel is a stalk-like style that bears a structure called a stigma. It is in the stigma where pollen is actually received. The diversity of angiosperms is largely attributable to the evolution of the flower. They vary in form and structure. In monocots, the flower parts occur in threes and multiples of threes, while in dicots, flower parts are in fours or fives and multiples of 4 or 5. Not all flowers have sepals, petals, and a carpel or a stamen. Those that do are said to be complete flowers, and those that do not are said to be incomplete. Flowers lacking petals are described as apetalous. An example, as shown here, is the calla lily. Not only is the calla lily apetalous, but it is also asepalous, which means it lacks the sepals that would normally be located on the outermost part of a complete flower. With neither a petal or a sepal, calla lilies are considered naked. Another example is the rue anemone. Instead of a ring of petals, the anemone sports a ring of sepals collectively called as the calyx. Meanwhile, we also have the terms perfect versus imperfect flowers. Flowers that have both the stamens and the carpels are called bisexual flowers, while unisexual flowers are those with either a stamen only or with a carpel only. Now, if both male and female flowers can be found on one plant, that plant is called a perfect flower, or another term is a monoecious flower. But if the male and female parts of a flower are found on separate plants, the plant is called an imperfect flower or a dioecious flower. An example of an imperfect flower is a squash. One flower can have the male portion and another can have the female portion. Now, since the occurrence of the reproductive parts of a flower differ for every species, some have only one, some have both, pollination can take two forms, either through self-pollination or cross-pollination. In self-pollination, it occurs when the pollen from the anther is deposited on the stigma of another flower on a different individual of the same species. But if it's cross-pollination, it is the transfer of pollen from an anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on a different individual of the same species. So let me repeat that again. Self-pollination occurs when the pollen from the anther is deposited on the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on a different individual of the same species. So pollination is just one step in the life cycle of angiosperms. The life cycle of angiosperms are characterized by what we call alternation of generations. This describes the life cycle of a plant as it alternates between a sexual phase and an asexual phase. So let's get to know each of these phases by starting first with the sporophyte phase or generation. This is the non-sexual stage in plants. Think of this as the stage where plants grow and develop. So as you can see in this diagram, it is on this region where we can find the sporophyte generation. As plants mature, they bear organs that function for reproduction. In the case of angiosperms, it is the flower. Now, this flower produces reproductive cells called spores. These spores are of two types, the microspore and the megaspore. The flower that produces these spores, okay, the microspore is the reproductive cell that gives rise to what we call the sperm cells for males, and the megaspore is the reproductive cell that gives rise to egg cells, which is for females. Now let's proceed to the next stage of this alternating generations. We have the gametophyte stage. This is the sexual stage in plants. Think of this stage as the development of sperm cells and egg cells from microspores and megaspores respectively. To compare, the female gametophyte is like the ovaries. Okay? The female gametophyte is like the ovaries that houses the egg cells, and the male gametophyte is the testis, which contains the sperm cells. In plants, however, the pollen grain is the male gametophyte, and the embryo sac is the female gametophyte. When the gametes that are formed from two of these gametophytes fuse and become fertilized, the result is a zygote, which will grow to become a sporophyte, and the cycle repeats again. To summarize the alternation of generation in angiosperms, the sporophyte produces flowers. Inside this flower, diploid cells undergo meiosis to produce haploid microspores and megaspores. These cells in turn develop into the gametophytes that produce the sperm and the egg cells by mitosis. As we go along the sexual reproduction in flowers, we will recall the concepts of mitosis and meiosis and haploid and diploid cells. Now we conclude this video by summarizing the following key concepts. Flowers are the reproductive structures of angiosperms. The sepals and petals are accessory parts. The stamens have pollen-containing anthers at their tips, and carpels consist of the ovary, each of which has one or more ovules, and the style, which is topped by the stigma. Flowering plants have a life cycle that involves an alternation of generations with distinct sporophyte and gametophytes, and pollination brings together the male and female gametophytes.